Okay, welcome everyone to our Future Teacher inclusive practice session. Excuse my voice. If you haven't been to any of the Future Teacher webinars before, and we know we've got quite a high number of registrations this time, we have a resource which is the same resource where you went to register, and I'm sharing on screen now, and you'll find all the previous and future topics that we're covering and have covered before. And so today's one is the inclusive practice one, but we've already run, was it 1 to 8, 3 times already over the years. And so all the recordings and resources and text chats and so on are all available there. Regarding today's session, and I'll put the link is already in the text chat, but I'll put the link in again so you've got access to that. There's a little bit of info in this panel about the project, and then about us, and then our guest speakers for today. We may add links to any presentations and resources shared after the event, and then further down you'll find the recording of today's session probably sometime next week, and then the previous resources and recordings. And we may open the main resource that we previously shared to remind you of some of the rich information and resources that are available there. And the recordings are there, like I say. And Lillian collates what people said in the registration they most want to learn. So do you want to cover that now, Lillian?
Unmute myself. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Ron. So we've got people joining us from mostly UK, but we have colleagues from the USA, Italy, Ireland, the United Arab Emirates, Canada, Germany, and France with us, which is great. And when you registered, you filled in a form and said what you wanted to get out of the session. So we've got themes across like insights into other organizations' approaches and digital accessibility practices. The people have come for best practice inspiration, how to create engaging educational environments. Some people are very interested in Liz's inclusive field trips or field work, and how to fully utilize technology to assist students with various learning needs, inclusion uses of ChatGPT. And then there's quite a large number of people who mentioned they'd like to be able to benchmark their organization's practice, find out how other organizations have dealt with digital accessibility, and how they've improved inclusive practice, how to encourage educators to engage with the agenda. And others want some short training modules, so I've collected some links we can add to the chat later. And Helen is here to share some free resources with people as well. And then strategies to bring about cultural change, of which, you know, I think the core panel have a lot of experience to bring to the webinar. So yeah, how to influence other educators, and one interesting point about where inclusivity and digital accessibility start and stop, and I guess, does it even matter? Okay, so yeah, back over to our main program. I think we're gonna actually go straight into introducing our first speaker. So Liz is a lecturer at the University of York, Department of Environment and Geography, and she is part of this network, and she presented their outputs from a project it's called Cultivate, and I attended her webinar with her colleagues, and I was so blown away by the sheer number of resources they've brought together to support inclusive field trips and field work. So over to Liz to share with us today.
Thank you. I'll just get my screen share up. Okay. Hopefully that is okay. So yes, thanks for the introduction, Lillian. Yeah, I'm Liz. I am a lecturer at the University of York in the Geography department. And I was part of a project called Cultivate, which aimed at growing an inclusive field teaching environment.
Liz, sorry, it's Alistair. I think we're seeing the wrong view.
Okay,
We're seeing your kind of presenter view rather than the
there we go.
slideshow.
Is that better?
Still seeing your whole slide show with the.
That should be doing it, shouldn't it?
Is that better?
Is that better? It worked then.
I know, it's funny, isn't it?
No.
Maybe end and then start again, and then you have to pick the monitor, I guess, or something.
Right, let me start again. Right, sorry.
It all went so well before we started.
It was, anyway, this is going to go really smoothly. Right, okay, if I do that, is that better?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. Sorry about that. So yes, I'm part of a Cultivate project, which was aimed at growing an inclusive field teaching environment, and I worked with Linda York at Bangor University and Simon Hutchinson at Salford University. And the project was funded by the Natural Environment Research Council and was in response to their call around digital technologies to open up environmental sciences. So they've identified that environmental sciences is not very diverse, and so they're trying to find ways to make it more inclusive, more diverse, and more equal. And the focus of our project was really on fieldwork. We identified that fieldwork teaching in particular has numerous barriers, not just about physicality, but also around sort of anxiety, mental health, a whole host of other barriers. So that's why we focused on how do we cultivate inclusivity into fieldwork using digital technologies. And this is the one that I'm really focusing on today in this short talk. We have like this bigger aim of how do we ensure that EDI is embedded into all our environmental education, which I'm not going to touch on so much today, but I'll signpost you to some of the resources that we've created. And underpinning our project was this idea of communities of practice. So it's not that myself and Linda and Simon are experts in EDI and fieldwork, we're not at all, but we're very much aware that dotted around HE, there are really great examples of creating more inclusive fieldwork teaching environments. And we wanted to pull that knowledge together to share with everybody, really. And I think that's something that we have challenges with in HE, in that we often work in silos and we're not really sharing that communities of practice. So that was kind of underpinning our project. As I kind of hinted to, there were quite a lot of stages to our project. It was only a 6-month project and we're a bit ambitious, but the focus of today is really about what we got out of engaging with practitioners and stakeholders and the resource development that came out of that engagement. So my talk is really going to be focused on, can digital technology help to make fieldwork more inclusive? And when we held focus groups with the community, the answer was kind of yes and no, you know, typical academic kind of discussion and debate. So what I'll go through is some of the digital technologies that we thought could make fieldwork more inclusive, but I'll also go through what we identified as challenges around that use of digital technology. So one example of digital technology was around helping us overcome the barrier of notebooks. So field notebooks are often a key feature of geography education. We expect students to be filling them in every day, recording data. But that can be a real barrier for students with mobility issues or dexterity issues, you know, when you're working in a cold environment, or for students with specific learning difficulties such as dyslexia or, you know, other processing issues. We explored how digital technology could help address some of these barriers. And things like voice recording apps were suggested so that students could record their notes rather than actually write them down, or making use of field note recording apps such as QGIS, EpiCollect, and one of my students was talking about Survey 123, and using those as ways of recording rather than this traditional form of a field notebook. We also had a bit of a discussion. Quite often we assess the field notebook to see how students have done with their note taking. But with the barriers in mind, we were thinking, well, maybe we should be assessing the outcomes of the field notebook rather than actually the field notebook itself. So how the field notebook is being used to inform or evidence a particular point in their reports, for example. Another really good example that another institution gave us was overcoming barriers about being heard. And this isn't just about people who might have difficulties hearing or who are hard of hearing. This is also about inclusivity for everybody, because often you're in a field, it's windy, it's wet, and you're trying to shout at your students the information that you want to get across to them. And often you're not being heard by the people at the back or the people who are far away. So one institution has actually hired museum tour guide equipment and used that in the field environment. And like I say, that makes it accessible to everybody and not just people with specific learning needs. There were some other really great examples of where institutions have been a bit more techie and have managed to get a laptop and a video recording equipment, so that if a student couldn't go up a steep slope, they could send a team up and then beam back the information that they're getting on the slope. But obviously that requires some quite good specialist technical expertise. We talked a lot about virtual field trips. So during the pandemic, there was kind of this explosion of virtual field trips because that was a way we could continue field teaching and learning. But virtual field trips have been around for a long time. And some of the best practice around virtual field trips is around helping to alleviate anxiety by having a virtual pre-trip ahead of the actual field trip. Students can get introduced to their surroundings, they can identify what the paths they're taking are, and that helps to open up conversations. For example, I'm going to really struggle on this section, my balance is not very good. Can we talk about it? And we can then really start to open up those discussions around some of the barriers that a student might face in the field. And also it's just about alleviating anxiety. And it's also a really good pre-trip prep for academic development as well. Students can start to prepare and think about the environments that they're in. Another way digital technology could help open up the field is through giving people options. I think EDI can be improved a lot by just giving students options in the way that they access their learning. So a really good example here is that we could give students a hand field guide or a book about identifying different plants or whatever they're doing in the field. But equally, we could identify apps that they could use, and then we give them the students the option, which one would you like to use? Similarly, that we could get students to use hand lenses, but equally they could use a camera zoom. So we explored how digital technology could actually just give us options to give to the students, and they can decide how they're going to engage within the field environment. We identified some apps that help to overcome particular barriers. So, for example, we often talk about colours in the field, but that could be a barrier for someone who is colourblind. So we talked about some apps that are actually helping to overcome specific barriers in that communication when we're talking about things like change in soil colour, for example, or change in vegetation cover. So we did identify some apps that helped overcome those. And finally, we looked at how digital technology can make the field trip more immersive. So we can now actually plot data in the field, and that can help students visualize what's going on. So for a student who might find it difficult to understand what the values they're writing down in their data tables, if they can actually plot it visually, then that really opens up that field environment and helps them really understand what's going on. But like I say, there is always a but. And we really explored that digital technology is not going to be the magic bullet that opens up field teaching and learning. And we talked a lot about pedagogy and learning outcomes, and making sure that if we are using technology, that it needs to be for a purpose. It needs to be addressing those learning outcomes, helping us addressing those learning outcomes, and not just because we've got this whizzy bit of kit that we want to use. And we also really do need to think about digital poverty as well within this debate. Just very quickly, to end my talk, I just want to introduce you to the project website, which I'll link to in the chat a bit later. And on there, you can find some of the resources that I talked about. So we've got a list of apps that might be useful. And we've also talked about a little bit more how these apps can be used to help open up the field. We've also got a page on storytelling. So these are stories that we have gathered from the community around the EDI challenges that people have faced and how they've overcome them, or kind of what the challenges they are, and a reflection on how you could overcome them. So this is really sharing people's experiences of EDI issues associated with field teaching and learning. We've also created a 10 ways booklet to make fieldwork more inclusive and accessible. That's available on the website. And if anybody's interested, we've created a workshop to help departments open up discussions around EDI and field discussions. So if you're interested in that, then please do contact me, and I'm happy to discuss with that. And so that's kind of the conclusion to my talk, but I'm happy to take any questions that you may have in the chat, and I'll try and address those. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I'll hand over to you, Lillian.
That's fabulous. Spot on timing wise as well. There are a couple of questions in the meeting chat, and feel free to kind of address them in the chat while we get the next speaker ready for her session, and then we'll come back to discussions at the end as well. So I think, Rosemary, are you introducing Polly?
I am indeed. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Polly Lee from the Open University, where she's an associate lecturer. Today, Polly's going to be talking about work that she and a colleague, Sarah Trubitsky, do at the Associate Lecturer Support and Professional Development team. So they're providing training and support sessions to other staff within the university. So I think, you know, we'll get a perspective on how do we influence others and extend their thinking on inclusive practice. So without further ado, over to you, Polly.
Many thanks. And
we're currently seeing not your presentation mode.
Yeah, I'm trying to get it going. That's it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Technology for you. Thank you very much. And yes, I'm Polly. Sarah Trubitsky has co-authored this presentation with me. And as Rosemary has said, we are both associate lecturers or tutors at the Open University. And we also both work within the Associate Lecturer Support and Professional Development unit there, particularly focusing on online synchronous classrooms and things like that. So the Open University is the biggest distance learning provider in the UK, with nearly 250,000 students, and there are nearly 5,000 part-time associate lecturers or tutors, and we support the students' learning remotely. And on most of the modules, the tutors have freedom to design their own tutorial sessions and to create their own materials as well. So the online synchronous classroom, which we use at the Open University, is Adobe Connect. And our approach is to help tutors to create those engaging materials, always including inclusivity and accessibility. And as we are giving some of our training sessions, then also explaining the accessibility features which we're using at the time within that session, and therefore discussing decisions we make in structuring the activities. So our focus, as Rosemary said today, is very much going to be from the staff development perspective of how we try and help our fellow tutor colleagues. And we do have to rely on cascading of information as well. So some of the resources which we have is the Tutoring Online team of about 20 who run part-time immersive 1 or 2 week modules, from everything getting used to Adobe Connect to much more advanced use, including pedagogy. self-study materials with forum support, peer associate lecturer support, workshops of an hour, again, everything from basics to advanced, and the AL Digital Help Center, which is for things other than Adobe Connect, but it's general digital help. So tutorials at the OU can be for very small groups, or of sort of 5, 6, or it can be for much larger groups, which we have to cater for anything up to several hundred. But we've said we use Adobe Connect. We do try and take the flipped classroom approach, where students have studied the materials. We know it doesn't always work, should be interactive. And the purpose of our tutorials could include any of these things of consolidating learning, addressing threshold concepts, developing confidence, and giving a sense of belonging. And that comes out later on. So our approach to this is that in getting the tutorials to be accessible and inclusive, bearing in mind we're dealing with all subject disciplines, then we think about the design of the activities within the tutorials and how students engage, the use of materials, including PowerPoint, and the use of features in Adobe Connect. And we'll be taking it hopefully in that order. So in staff development, what we're aiming to do is make the tutors more accessibility aware. So for instance, first of all, are they aware of the various issues? And in our center circle on the right here, we have some of the issues and only a very small number of the issues which might crop up for us as individual tutors. And indeed, when we're doing some of our training sessions. So we encourage the tutors to check what we call disability markers for each student who's booked onto a tutorial. It's also encouraging our fellow tutor colleagues to be aware of the resources which we've got available within our own institution. That includes the accessibility and user evaluation team, a special website for tutors where there's additional information, general information on these different accessibility issues and disabilities that people might have, but then always referring them back to the disability information for students, recognizing that students are unique. And it's also working with the disability team who can provide extra resources like a British Sign Language interpreter or a note taker or live captioning as that needs turning on, and it's works slightly differently in Adobe Connect, but I won't worry about individual issues today. Another important point we have is explaining why we need a baseline, and this is the approach we take, because we've said that the tutors are part-time, they work independently to a great extent, and we realise therefore that it can be difficult to reach all of those tutors. So we're concentrating, or we have been concentrating, on what we call the easy wins and approaches which are most beneficial with the least effort. So this is probably the slide I'm going to be spending the longest period of time on. What we have done is worked out what are the easy to do things, what can we get across to the majority of tutors quickly, easily, and can get them to do well. Bearing in mind we have some tutors who are highly experienced and some who are new to teaching within higher education. I'm not going to go through every slide, but one slide I do want to talk about, or sorry, one point I do want to talk about is having alternatives for activities and different ways for our students to respond and participate. And indeed, we model this as good practice when we're running our own training sessions. So just as an example, we could have a whiteboard for students to type on. Even though whiteboards might not be accessible, we can also encourage them to participate in the chat box. So there are alternatives. And feedback from a tutorial which I was doing only last week, a couple of students said, and neither of them had disability markers, they said, oh, Polly, it was so obvious you were taking an inclusive approach. And they liked that. Okay, and the thing they particularly liked was once they'd done their writing, that I had actually read out their chat contributions, which sometimes we group, particularly if it's been on a whiteboard, but actually reading out chat contributions. Why the students liked it is that it really affirmed them. So by practicing good accessibility, we were actually also affirming other students. Something else we do a lot of is we encourage students to hand out slides in advance. And sometimes we say most slides in advance, because obviously we don't want slides which have got answers on to a previous question. So we recognize that we have students who book who have a declared disability, which we take account of, but we also recognize that we can have a lot of students who book either with an undeclared disability, and we have a lot of students with that, or an undiagnosed disability. And last week, again, I had a student, again, not with a disability, but in the tutorial evaluation, appreciate these having the slides in advance and saying, I do need to look at the PowerPoint more before tutorials. In other words, that student was gaining from having the PowerPoints up front and realized she could actually gain even more. So it turns out the easy things to do aren't necessarily technical at all. And the majority of the easy things are familiar to most of the associate lecturers. Yes, there are some things we need to do a little bit more work on. One of them is, as a training team, making sure that we have an even wider proportion of EALs more familiar with things like reading order and alt text. So moving on now to next steps, on the right-hand side, we've got here some of the things of sophisticated alt text and saying what people should get from an image and not just describing the image. And that can be quite difficult if you don't want to give too much information away, but you want to make the students think. So those things we are working on, and we will be getting there. And the way we do it is by, if you'll excuse me, using an idiom when I've said we don't use idioms, chipping away, using several different ways to engage with tutors. It's integral to all the designs of a session, not just for tools. We focus on a baseline, particularly for new tutors. We do use cascading. We'd like to use it even more. And there's evidence that this approach is working, and accessibility and awareness is increasing, and it improves the quality of the tutorials, not just for those who need it, but for everybody. And that's just our contact details. Thank you.
Fabulous. Spot on timing wise as well. Thank you very much, Polly. That was fabulous. And for people who have not been on our webinars before, we do ring a little bell for our speakers to know when they're halfway through in a minute too. And next up is over to Alistair to introduce Helen.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, many of you will have used Helen's work, even if you didn't know you were using it or didn't know it was Helen. She's the force behind the SCULPT acronym and the Worcestershire County Council website area that there's some fantastic training materials on. But she's now going back to being a student and doing a doctorate in embedding accessibility into the digital skills of all young people. So if I've got that not exactly right, I'm sure she can correct me, but she's got a passion for making those simple things. As we saw that lovely quote earlier, you know, the hard bits, sorry, the technical bits are the relatively easy bits. The easy things to do are not technical at all. And Helen is a master at showing us that. So Helen, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen and make it work this time. Can I check everybody can see the screen?
Yep, perfect.
And hopefully my PowerPoint as well. Okay, so as Alistair said, I'm Helen Wilson. In my professional work, I'm senior digital designer, but I'm going back to university. I start on Monday, but this is my first time publicly sharing this, all these ideas, and I've been developing them over, over about 9 months. And I'm a great believer that everyone can have access to the basics and get that conversation about accessibility, that basic conversation as the norm. So I'm going to explain my research, but towards the end of the presentation, I'll explain how you can use my resources or the resources off the back of the research that I'm doing. So to start with, I'm a great believer in the culture of digital accessibility, and everybody having access to know those basics so they can apply them in their everyday world. Because we all know 1 in 5, these are the facts we've heard, 1 in 5 potentially live with disabilities. It's a legal requirement. We have the WCAG stuff. But those everyday basics affect everyone. It's universal design. And the Microsoft Inclusive Toolkit has this great situational, temporary, permanent model that kind of gets people thinking that everybody actually is affected or impacted by good design or inclusive design. And to me, most young people are both creators as well as consumers. It's not just that ICT curriculum, it's everyone. You could have an early years student, they post on social media too. So for me, I'm not talking about WCAG, as I said, I'm talking about young people and everyone knowing the very basic principles of digital accessibility. And I'm talking about those basic principles either being taught or brought to the attention of young people today. So things like colors and color contrast, video captions, image descriptions, alt text, naming links, transcripts, clear language, fonts, reading order, headings, titles, tables, using accessibility checkers. We're all quite familiar with these, but what is it that the students know? Do they know anything? Do young people know about this thing if you stop them in the street and ask them? So the first 6 on the left, I think are kind of really easy concepts to get over. But this has all come from my own context of training basic digital accessibility in the workplace. And it's often felt very much like a battle or an uphill battle just to get engagement. So beyond that carrot and stick of it's a legal requirement, these are some of the observations that I've had, and they're echoed by a lot of people who've written on the subject too. And these are going to sound familiar to you. So people come with the assumptions, it's technical, it's complex, it's costly, it's time consuming, it's not my responsibility, it's extra workload, and all of those things. But actually, these are basic things. These aren't those complex technical things. So once that was kind of overcome and you get people in the room, then you had, and this was the bit I kind of started to really think about, that real challenge of unlearning to relearn. So you'll have people who've done things for like 25, 30 years, and they're struggling with just some basic concepts or changes to the way they do things. But once they got it and they were engaged, they were really surprised how simple it was. And I had someone say, gosh, a 10-year-old could do this. And it really got me thinking. But also that context of why. So why do we need to do it? And this is how. Because if you don't understand the why, the how, you'll have that barrier to the how. So I thought, if you address this long term, what if young people learned this? What if they were more aware? So in my head, you can tell I went to Back to the Future over Christmas. I just thought, if these classroom of people that are in front of me, what if I went in a DeLorean like back 20 years and they'd been taught these basics years ago? Would we be having these challenges? Would we be having to demystify disability, accessibility, and retrofitting kind of skills over stuff they've already learned? And I started to think, well, what if we started teaching teaching students or school children about this today? So I started reading about like the training gap and what's out there, and had some early conversations with young people. And there was clearly kind of skills on knowledge gap, because there was quite a few blank stares, and the only people who really got it it had impacted their life somehow because they had a relative. But in the curriculum in schools, it didn't appear, it wasn't taught, the awareness wasn't kind of shared, you know. The same with the curriculum gap in FE and HE. Training in workplaces is another gap. There's lots of training advice out there, but is it used? So on the wider remit of people really knowing about this stuff in all organisations, in businesses, councils, it's not there. So it was quite kind of eye-opening for me to kind of see it's not really in the mainstream. And we've got this society with a knowledge gap. Or it was kind of hidden with like specialist groups or enthusiasts or people within the accessibility community. It hadn't really got any wider than that. But there was some kind of other things. So progress reports of how people hadn't kind of picked up the WCAG, meeting the regulations, organisational maturity wasn't quite there. You know, all these things, there's a lot of work to do out there. But there was some recent progress in that government have come up with some career pathways. You're now seeing jobs in accessibility. There's an apprenticeship pathway at level 4. We've got the IAAP certifications, the International Association of Accessibility Practitioners. British Sign Language, the Act came in, and the GCSE conversation has kind of got going again under that. But how can we possibly have a society trying to kind of prevent barriers when they're not educated in it? So to me, the young people are our generation. And I believe that everyone, not just young people, but everyone, and that's kind of where the Sculpt stuff came from as well, is like, if we kind of started teaching our next generation with lifelong skills, that by default it became a normal thing that you just add captions to videos. They design a poster for schoolwork aware of colour contrast, can write descriptive links because that's the way you do it, add alt text because they understand that's necessary for other people, or when images don't load, put headings in their work properly, not just bold and big, using accessibility checkers and being aware of them. And that's social media awareness, because there's so much out there with, you know, like hashtags and you know, like a whole sort of emojis instead of text. But just imagine if that was like normal. So to me, I want to kind of get the conversation started that actually we should be looking at our next generation. And that's where my research, my academic research, will be kind of framed by. But to me, it's relevant to everyone, all students in education, not just subject level teaching, and it's wider awareness in young people. But what I wanted to do was kind of get create research that was useful, and I've put a lot of thing out on networks, and AbilityNet let me write an article, and I've had loads of contacts off that, which has been fantastic. But I've also kind of developed a website, because if I do go in classrooms, I need those resources to explain what I'm talking about, what these things are. And over the summer, I've built a website to kind of put those resources out in the world, get some feedback. There's still work to do there. But the website's called Learn to Enable, or Learn to Enable Digital for Everyone. And on it, in the materials, I haven't just got digital skills. There's basic models of disability that are explained, everyday barriers we all face, you know, that model from Microsoft. Did you know information? There's a great video out there from PwC. It's called You're Welcome, and it's showing you curb cuts, electric toothbrushes, those sorts of things. There's 12 basic digital skills to learn, to kind of watch why we do it, and this is how you can do it. Some of the research ideas are starting to form. And then I also had a poster, it's an A3 poster. Maybe you could put it in an office, in a workplace, and people read it and see it. But as it's there, I just thought it's really useful for anyone to steer colleagues to maybe add to an armory of accessibility kind of resources you've got, steer learners to it, to make them aware. And it's a whole picture to me. It's about that culture and that kind of change and getting people to recognize this. So the website, as I said, is learntoenable.co.uk. I've written an article on AbilityNet called Time to Sow New Seeds for Digital Accessibility, which is a bit more in depth of what I've said to you today. And I really do look forward to any questions or suggestions or input that you've got as I start to formulate my research ready for a real, I think, exciting academic journey. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. That's great. We've got the links to that Learn to Enable in the chat pane there. So do have a look at that. And Helen, again, there may be some questions, as with other speakers, coming to the chat. So have a look through that chat and see if there's anything specific people might want to pick up.
Brilliant.
And meanwhile, from that, what we're going to do now, if you want to stop sharing your screen for the minute, that's great. What we're going to do now is open up for a time of general discussion on the different elements. It's a chance to talk to any of the presenters, ask specific questions outside of the chat, but we also wanted to kind of raise the whole debate about artificial intelligence and how that might be impacted on inclusion. So shall I kick off, Lillian, with a very small, with the bit that started that whole conversation for...
I wonder if we could actually pass people information that they can go away with as early as possible, because once we get talking, we always run over time. So I know lots of people, and I think we've heard a lot of great ideas from Polly and Liz and Helen about ways that we can kind of engage our colleagues. I mean, let's face it, those of us who are here, we're the converted, right? And we're all wondering, how do we get other people on board? So for instance, I wanted to share my kind of shifting digital accessibility idea, which is kind of something you can do in your organization. Sit down with a couple of people and work out if you have planned to kind of invade your entire organization with the concepts around digital accessibility practice. And if you don't kind of approach it with a kind of change management attitude, you're only ever going to do little pockets of practice. So that's one suggestion, and I've put that link in the chat there. And then Alistair has another kind of approach, which is very much organizational as well, which is the accessibility maturity model. Alistair, I can leave you to talk about that.
Okay, yeah, I'll share my screen very quickly, and I'll just drop a link in there as well. So if I share that screen, that should be coming through, and I'll put the link in. So this is just different ways of translating accessibility, and that point we've already made several times about it. People think it's hard, they perceive it's hard, but actually when you translate it to their own language, what it means for you in your role, working on the resources you use, it's often considerably simpler. So here's the link to the resource, when I can find the chat pane again. That might have to go in the chat. There we are. And there are 3 different levels on which we can explore assessing your whole institution, and there's examples there. And there's a sort of DIY version, like of the model that we use, and plenty of information there, and some free downloads of things that you want if you wanted to download a copy yourself. And then there's also a module level one, because at the level where somebody's designing a module, putting a module together, that's the level where very often the barriers are created, and the blending between usability, inclusion, learning design, all of those blend together, and that's really important for accessibility. And again, there's links there to some freely downloadable resources as well as some supported resources, but that will help you shape the culture in which these individual practices. Many of the brilliant things we've heard today are individual practices, and if they're not embedded in strategy and policy, when those people, passionate people leading those practices, move on to another job, then suddenly you go from being a hero to being a zero sometimes as an institution. So think about the strategy and embedding.
Yeah, and earlier, Alistair, you mentioned a really good point when Helen was presenting as well. How many IT, computing, and other digital document creation software courses mention accessibility. You know, you might decide to go on a Word course, but does it actually tell you why the headings are important? And does it even teach you about alt text? So it's got to be pervasive across our culture, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I think Liz has answered Mike's question about whose responsibility is it for accessibility and inclusion, students or staff? And I don't know, Liz, if you just want to quickly sum up your reply to Mike on that question.
Yeah, I can do. Yeah, so I think really it's a partnership. So I think at the planning stage, when you're planning field work, we do need to be, as staff, we need to be taking responsibility and thinking about inclusivity and how we're designing our field work around the learning outcomes and how we can make sure it's as inclusive as possible based on the learning outcomes. But I do think the students need to take responsibility for themselves as well and let us know issues that they might face or ways around. It's about opening up those conversations, I think, how we can get students to communicate with us and how we can adapt based on those conversations with students. So I really see it as a partnership. I think both sides need to take responsibility for inclusivity and accessibility in the field.
Yeah, and I think that's very valid, you know, what Helen's doing in terms of like thinking about the skills that students have. I mean, one day they may come to your course, Liz, and do field work, and they're already aware of the best kind of tools that help them in field work. Wouldn't that be a great, you know, bringing together of all that we're trying to do? Dominic's got his hand up. Dominic.
Hi. Well, I kind of maybe thought we might sort of bring together some of the accessibility and AI advancements if we're ready for that. And
I think we are. Go for
react it. because actually I kind of want to continue and inject a slightly contrarian note to the discussion so far.
We would expect nothing more.
And because I've been teaching people how to make accessible documents for, well, you know, many years now, and I don't see them, and I sort of disagree that it doesn't have to be hard. I think it is hard because I'm getting sort of things with sort of fairly basic accessibility errors from accessibility professionals in terms of like when it comes to document structure, or the website that we just looked at has really bad advice on alt tag to images. That's really hard to do, and most people don't really read the WCAG guidelines because it's not descriptions at all. It's textual alternatives, and you know, there was a study done recently looking at people who sell accessibility services and how accessible their websites are, and they're far from 100%. I occasionally look at RNIB's website; they don't get everything right either. So I'm just kind of want to sort of say that sometimes getting this right is actually quite complicated. But you know, I mean, we can sort of have debate that, but that's not really where I want to go with. But my sort of vision is now that we have this artificial intelligence stuff happening, I see a huge potential of actually making things, enabling access to things in a way that is really hard to achieve just kind of through training, because there's always new people coming in and people are going to have, you know, busy in all sorts of ways and have different skills. But I've been playing around with ChatGPT and some of the other tools that I'll share a link. I've been putting together a bunch of tools that people can have a look at, and I'm seeing huge potential, for example, for accessing text and documents in terms of like getting summaries, getting structure, getting bullet points out of a unstructured text or unstructured text from a table, or a table from a text. There's so much stuff is happening, and I've actually spoken to one of our colleagues who was a screen user, and she said that she found it quite useful already, and people are going to access. So I think there's many things are happening. I saw a video online, somebody saying that they actually often just paste the website into ChatGPT and ask for a summary rather than having to sort of trawl through all that information on it. So I think we're not anywhere near this being perfect or sort of ready for just anybody, but I think we're seeing this huge opportunity for actually getting tools in front of people to enable them to kind of not having to rely on other people getting things right, because and I'm sort of very skeptical we can get this at scale. You know, we certainly should try. I'm not saying we shouldn't try, and I do it every day. I try, but it's more a question of actually I want to focus on enabling people to kind of help themselves, because they will live in a world where documents and websites and tools are not created by people who kind of think about accessibility. And so that's kind of where my excitement.
I think it's a really good point as well, that we almost need a two-pronged approach. We're aiming to professionalize accessibility, that it becomes, you know, a good practice, particularly in an academic context when people are perfectly happy doing really complex you know, Harvard referencing and all the rest of it, but they say it's too hard to work out how to put structure headings in a document. But I think you're right that as well as working at that end, we can enable people. I've got an example here of a bit of text. You know, I was working with somebody recently, and they said this is some of the text that we as learning developers are given from by academics, and we have to try to make something of it, and it's so tricky. And then we thought, well, what would that look like if we ran it through one of the artificial intelligence bots, and this is what it came up with. Something 100 times simpler. Whether it's 100 times accurate is another question, but it's a nice example of how language level might be improved. And you talked about bullet points, you know, taking something, turning it into bullet points or a table. So there's definitely some areas there we could look at. I don't know if other people have got examples of things that they have done using artificial intelligence as as a tool for inclusion in exactly the same sort of way that Dominic's encouraging us.
Can I just quickly, while people are thinking, Alice, to just answer a question somebody just went through on the chat, is the question of hallucination. And that's a real problem and well-known quantity. Is the way these large language models on which all of this is based work, is they essentially predict the next token, and they're thinking, okay, this let's make this plausible looking given the context that I know, and so it will make things up. However, the hallucination is kind of random, and it isn't nearly as sort of pervasive. So it's not about asking for facts, but it's really good at sort of getting a summary out of things. And sometimes it may even help somebody creating a website make a nice summary and then check it, make sure it's accurate. So it's actually, so I agree. That's why I keep saying it's not perfect and it's not sort of reliable, but we're already seeing sort of use cases. And again, on the link that I shared, I've put a bunch of articles together, the people saying how they use it already, where people, while acknowledging those imperfections and sort of the factual errors and hallucinations, they're actually kind of making use of it in helping them understand things that are difficult to understand. And sometimes getting some sort of a hallucination back can actually help you engage with the text. So here I'm talking more about comprehension than the structure thing. But yeah, I agree. It's you're not getting perfection, but you're getting often something better than you would get if you didn't have it. So that's kind of where we are at the moment.
Thank you for that.
Sorry, Alistair. It's a really interesting question though, because these AI bots are really good at plausible untruths, which when you're reading it, if you've got enough knowledge, you can identify it as a plausible untruth. If we're then talking about it creating, say, alt text or that kind of thing, how are we deciding whether it's a plausible untruth or not? Because actually you're using the alt text because you can't see the image. It can tell you it's a picture of the most glamorous woman in the world and then give you me as the picture, and that ain't the truth. So, how do we differentiate that? And there's some really interesting things unpicked there.
Can I also sort of just react to it? Because I mean, you're absolutely right. But this alt text is not a description of the image. It's a textual alternative to the image. So very often, lots of images don't need alt text because they're just there for decoration. So there's actually kind of an interesting question there, whether what is the truth? And there's lots of fine distinctions you need to make when you think about alt text. So it's not that's why I keep saying it's not a very easy thing, but in a way, I'm not necessarily advocating that this stuff is used without any qualifications. And again, ChatGPT is just a preview. It's not the only thing out there. There's lots of stuff is happening. You already have stuff built into Microsoft Word, Microsoft Office. In PowerPoint, you can create some icon annotated lists in PowerPoint using some of the same technology. I think there's a lot of power in there that's already there. And we're at the very cusp of it, because some of these new innovations that were only released sort of last year, and the people are now starting thinking about products and how they can actually improve them and what the sort of back and forth is. So I agree, that's absolutely 100% true with the sort of plausible untruth, but it isn't really a plausible untruth. It's an ability to kind of to engage with the content and give you something useful out, and it's already kind of here. It is happening. People are using it for real things, and I in a way I kind of see the hope in that direction. More so than and I'm hoping they will be built into JAWS eventually, or tools like that actually can give you more information about what's on a web page than or somebody with dyslexia or so on, than we can do just by kind of relying on people doing it right in the first place.
So any other comments for folk or anything in the chat? Any examples of people that have been using ChatGPT or other tools?
I was just sharing with those who were here earlier that I was using it almost like a thesaurus. You know, I often use a thesaurus to find an alternative word, but I was putting little sentences in to see what it was offering up as an alternative way of structuring a sentence. And I found that helpful. I felt like I was co-writing, and it helped to make writing easier. So I was using it as a tool, and I'm kind of thinking, you know, this idea of using it as an inclusive tool, it's a really difficult thing, isn't it, to kind of say to students, oh, you know, there are lots of tools that can help you, but where does that line get drawn between an inclusion tool and an academic integrity flouting device? And Claudia has a hand up.
Yeah, just to add to that, the idea of using it as a tool, I think, is a great practice. I was actually watching a video that a physics academic uploaded a while back, where he was assessing ChatGPT, and he was really surprised when he plugged some questions into it, because what he said was that it got the theory, it got the working out correct, but the answers were completely wrong. The maths was way off, and he threw it a question to write some code, and he immediately picked up, oh, it's made a mistake that I'm hoping that my students won't make.
Right.
So it could be a really valuable opportunity to actually have sessions with students where you plug these questions in, and it could help reaffirm to them that they understand the working out, but they also recognize that the final answer that's been arrived at is wrong, and kind of further deepen their understanding.
Mike, you've got your hand up?
Yeah, I put it in the chat, but I think the problem with any of these things is the user has to understand the limitations. And how do you get users to understand? I mean, you had that engineer, do you remember, who was sacked from Google, who was supposed to be looking at their AI chatbot and was claiming it was sentient, and they sacked him for being an idiot, you know, for making that claim. And there is a real issue there of, you know, everybody is claiming that AI is added to virtually anything you buy, because you can't sell it unless you claim it's AI. And it can't really, it's not explainable half the time. And so what does the user do? I mean, medical products have to be tested and have to be validated. So what about AI products being validated and tested in a similar way?
Yeah.
I mean, can I maybe sort of elaborate on, I said it in the chat, but in a way we often think of this sort of the popular perceptions as as a question answering tool, you know, ChatGPT. But I think what Delaney was saying is important. I suggested in the chat that we think of it as a co-creation tool. And that goes both for DALL-E, for image generation, and so on. And I was recently listening to an interview with the inventor of the Python programming language. And he said, I actually use GitHub Copilot, which is the specifically coding-based tool, to help me kind of get started, generate some ideas, and then, you know, I sort of use bits of the code. And in a way, somebody also recently compared it for writing computer code, as in similar to how much of programmers' time is spent copying and pasting stuff from forums and then modifying it for themselves. So this is kind of really not that different. And I actually gave it a question and said, can you give me a table out of this data? And it created a good table. And I said, make an HTML table out of it with banded rows. And it gave me perfectly acceptable HTML that was actually hopefully also accessible because it marked the headings in that HTML table in the code. So in a way, and that I could have done it myself, but it's just saved me so much time. And I pasted it into a real HTML page and it worked. I was then playing around with some JavaScript to make some of it clickable. That because I know enough, I was able to sort of fix some of the errors it gave me, but it helped me with that. So as a tool for me, it was incredibly empowering and enabling because I would not have even started doing it because I was thinking it's just too much work. But then here I could give it that instruction. So it's that sort of iterative process that I can say, it gives me something and say, you know what, can you fix this? I was playing around with translating a poem and it translated a word wrong consistently in that poem. I said, you know what, this word means something different. And then it retranslated it with the correct meaning. So again, having that sort of iterative moment, I think that's kind of where the power of it lies. And the chatty and sort of question answering bit, I think is slightly misleading.
Dominic, I'm just going to pause for a moment just to say to people, we are aware it's 2 o'clock and some people will have to go, and it's great. We'll, we would love to see you next month as well. We will continue this discussion. We normally hang on for about 10-15 minutes or something, as long as it takes. But if you do need to go, do go. And if you're on the Future Teacher list, you'll get notification as to when we've got the video up, and then a little bit later when we've got the accurate transcripts up as well. So I didn't want to stop the conversation. I did want to give people permission to go if they need to. And the link for the next session is in the chat. And the link for the Future Teacher mailing list is coming into the chat now as well. So that if you're not on that and you want it to be. So back to the conversation. Thank you very much, Claudia, Mike, and Dominic, who have been sort of kicking us off on this. Ron, you had an example of getting ChatGPT to write some accessible code, I think. Is that right?
Sorry, can I just say, I'm just going to stop the recording now,
Okay.
and then we'll go back to Ron.